I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Professor James Randall. James Randall was the Stead Family Professor of English Emeritus at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, where he taught African American literature and English from 1969 until his retirement in 2010. He actually served as chair of the African American Studies program there for many years. And he was also a founding member of the Iowa African American Museum based in Cedar Rapids. It's indeed my pleasure to welcome Professor James Randall to this podium.
I want to thank you for coming out tonight for this program. And I'm going to speak a bit about, of course, the importance of African American studies, and to share with you some of my traveling through this discipline. Some of the things that led me to it and led me to engage with it, and try also to give a note of the continuing importance of it, of course. We may find it interesting, perhaps even somewhat amusing at times, to contemplate some of the matters and elements that serve as markers or nodes to set us off on paths which become more significant as we develop and our experiences broaden and deepen. Some of these markers or nodes grow to the degree of becoming essential planks of our avocation or vocation. If we have some telling degrees of luck, often flavored and tempered with righteous streams of sweat produced by work, we can dare to achieve the state aspired to in the lines of the poet Robert Frost, when a speaker in one of his poems hopes that our avocation and vocation become one. When the term dream job is spouted, I like to think that oftentimes the situations and experiences conjured up, better yet recalled, is one that reflects a fine blend of vocation and avocation. I am thinking that that reflection is quite true for most of the faculty and staff and visitors here tonight. And I am thinking that most of the students in this audience will strive to achieve this blend in full. At least this goal is a quite worthy one. Like perhaps many of us, I have had frustrations and disappointments and problematic, even troubling experiences. However, I have had rewarding experiences which can be counted as good reflections of vocation and avocation dancing together to the resounding notes of harmonic drums. My teaching of literature and African American studies has been one of those enriching experiences for me, a journey of exertion and rewards in engaging in significant work. One of the early markers or nodes that had an effect on me, although I did not really see the effect of it until much, much later, was a childhood task bestowed upon me by my father. My father valued education and civic awareness to a very high degree. His formal education, as did that of too many rural black boys of his generation ended after the 6th grade. He then began a long period in unskilled labor stints. In addition, the burdens and evils of racial segregation proscribed most good jobs from black people during those times. This situation was too true in the southeastern corner of North Carolina and the northeastern corner of South Carolina, the cross-border area where he lived. It was too true all over the South and in many other areas also. I grew up in a small town, really a village, located 30 miles from the Atlantic Ocean in the Green Swamp area of southeastern North Carolina. My mother also had an active role in preparing me for and spurring me on through school. Due to some quirk with records, I was not allowed to enter school when I showed up to enter the 1st grade because I did not have a birth certificate, and thus, in a manner, I did not exist. It must have taken well over 2 months before affidavits sworn to by the midwife who attended at my birth and by other witnesses were registered to and accepted by the state, thus acknowledging me as indeed existing as a colored citizen of North Carolina. In the meantime, I had missed practically the first 3 months of school, as the other students had gone sailing along. I did not suffer academically for being so late in entering, because my mother had done a fine job of teaching me the basic elements of reading and writing and arithmetic, and I was able to join in and move well along. My mother had finished 10th grade by living with relatives in a larger town, the town of Wilmington, North Carolina, because high school access was limited in our village area during her school era. One mildly problematic consequence of my late entry into school was that I was viewed as, by some as the new kid and had to go through some rites of passage without companions. For example, the older boys in the higher grades at the school set me up to box with the toughest kid in the 1st grade. I remember his name well, Dusty Webb. Dusty had 2 tough older brothers, but he was even tougher than they were. We were given gloves. The gloves were put on us and fitted on us. We were then set to box each other. Our bout was encircled by the rest of the students, and we went at it, Dusty and I, me very reluctantly. I did get a lucky swing that unhooked the snap of Dusty's pants, and his pants fell down. There were also girls in the audience looking at this too. And the bout ended at that point. I, from then on, had bragging rights that I had beat the pants off him. And Dusty and I became friends. And I also became friends with his brothers after that as well. That was the end of my boxing career. In the mid-1950s, a paper mill was built and established 10 miles from my hometown, and my father and several black men and white men of the area were able to get jobs there. Thus, a steady pattern of fixed, reliable work brought some economic progress to the area, and improved living standards became a reality for several people. This was still the era of segregation, and black men worked primarily in the wood yard, while white men worked primarily at better jobs within the paper plant itself. In 1965, right after I finished college, I had a summer job at the paper plant, and I became the first black worker to work in a non-custodial role within the plant. When I worked on the heralded gigantic paper machine, the Carolina Bell. There were even pictures of this paper machine in some of the books at the time. My father noted then that I was paid slightly higher, more in salary, than he was paid. He was still working there then, too, even though he had several years of seniority. And this gives us part of a glimpse in this sort of skewered economic picture of things. And, of course, ways in which access to better conditions were limited. The childhood task that my father bestowed upon me that served as a sleeper node for development later involved my stint as a newspaper boy. And I use that term very loosely because this was a very small operation. My father was quite conscious of concerns regarding civil rights and situations of African Americans in general. He was an active member of Friendship Church, in which he had an officer's role. This was the local AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. He would later send one of my cousins to 2 AME-affiliated colleges, Kittrell Junior College in North Central North Carolina, and Allen University in Columbia, South Carolina, from which she graduated in 1959. He also had a significant role in the education of my elder sister, his daughter, who was born when he was a teenager, technically my half-sister, but in full spirit, my full sister, who graduated in 1950 from Shaw University, another of the historically black colleges located in Raleigh, North Carolina. I would graduate from college in 1965, and one of my 2 younger brothers and my 3 younger sisters would also finish college. Thus, the seeds of education planted by my parents in their cases would develop into productive plants. My father also belonged to the Masons. He liked to keep abreast of the news, and he subscribed to 3 state and local newspapers: the Raleigh News and Observer, the Wilmington Morning Star. Wilmington, the town located 30 miles away, was the largest town in our area, and the News Reporter, a biweekly paper located in our county seat. He wanted more news available featuring African American interest. So he became a small-time, actually a type of community service volunteer more than anything else, a local distributor of weekly editions of 2 African American newspapers, the Baltimore Afro-American and the Norfolk Journal and Guide, the latter located in Norfolk, Virginia. He received his bundles of papers by mail each week, and it became my task to distribute the papers to clients within the small town. He made other arrangements for other clients who lived beyond the town area. I had become an avid and curious reader ever since my mother had taught me to read, and these newspapers became new fields of adventure and exploration for me. As I thought back later, I realized that the news and materials of these papers had an important role in broadening my awareness of African American concerns, and also of expanding my awareness of nuances of the spectrum of national and global concerns. Of course, this is what we want largely, and what we should expect and experience: a deeper and broader awareness of our world and its situations. Still, as a black child of the Green Swamp, I was able to come a bit tempered to wider world events. I remember fondly the summers when I was 10 and 11 years old. As usual, I had a lot of work to do during the summer, tending our home use livestock and tending and cultivating our vegetable gardens and patches of other crops, especially doing a lot of hoeing of weeds. However, I had a lot of flexible time, and I spent much of it sitting on my grandmother's front porch right next door and reading. Yes, there were a number of bouts of playtime, but there were many more periods of reading. A lot of comic books, especially the classic comics, featuring illustrated novels and illustrated historical accounts. I read a lot of regular novels that I got from the Book of the Month Club, though I could never always pay the fee that was required all of the time. Things changed notably during the summer when I turned 12. I went to work on tobacco farms. During the first 2 summers there, I worked at the tobacco barns as a stick boy, placing the sticks strung with the green leaves of tobacco onto the lower tiers of the curing barn. The bigger boys and men working in the fields would later come in and arrange the sticks on tiers all the way to the top of the barn. I became one of the regular field workers, a cropper, during the summer that I turned 14. And the croppers picked the leaves off the tobacco stalks. And we would go through a field maybe from 5 to 8 times, depending upon the season, and harvesting this tobacco. Now it was a matter of picking tobacco leaves in the bearing sun all day long. I also became something of a mule handler. We used mules to pull the crates, which we croppers would gradually fill with leaves through the fields. The mules also had to be geared and hitched in the morning, tended at noon, and tended and stabled or pastured at the end of the day. My summers were now overfilled with tobacco harvesting. I looked back wistfully on my previous summers of luxurious reading. In a projection toward future activities, my youthful association with reading and my later involvement with studying and teaching, like the experiences of many of us here in this audience, would lead me to acquire many books in my personal library, which now numbers around 20,000 books. My wife sometimes teases me for being a bibliomaniac. The greater part of my books fit under the category of African world studies. In a process of winnowing down my amount, I recently donated over 1,200 books, many on African American and a number on African culture and history, to the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, to the library there. We had a smaller library earlier, but of course it was lost during the floods of 2008. I aim to add another like donation to the museum's library during this year of 2012. This activity is another example of how developing patterns, in this case, may lead to results of some value. Another significant marker or mode that had an effect on me and many, many others was the general civil rights movement, heralded dramatically by the 1954 Supreme Court decision against school segregation and the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, events of which we have become well aware now. One local effect that the 1954 Supreme Court decision had in my community had to do with the schooling situation. Suddenly it was determined that the colored children of my hometown needed a new school. What we call the white school was constructed of bricks. It had central heating. It had running water. It had modern toilets. The colored school was constructed of wood, located on the edge of town, had outdoor toilets, had pot-belly stoves, into which was fed wood or coal for heating. And we got hand-me-down school books that the other students, the white students, had used a year or years before. We had no cafeteria. It was decided that we needed a new school. And as we think about it, of course, we realize that this was an attempt to withstay the impact of integration. Because if the colored students had a modern equipped school, then they had more or less almost equal facilities in a manner. And although there were still many inequities, there was some of the reasoning behind it in a way. So this new school was intended to fend off integration. And it opened during my 7th grade year. I would have gone to a different school for 7th and 8th grade, actually the high school that I eventually went to. But we had a new school building, and so this opened there. So as we think about some of the events of that era, of that period, of the 1954 Supreme Court decision, we see it working its way out in a number of ways, and this was one of them, in effect. In addition to another note, that my father was a member of the part of the local school board, became a member of the local school board. We had a local school board for the colored schools and also another board for the white school. And so my father was a board member for the colored school, so he did have a role in part in shepherding some of those steps that the new school began to take. Of course, we see many changes that have taken place since that period, since that time. Later, my younger brother and my 2 younger sisters would attend integrated schools in that area, but at my time, this was not so. Another event that hit a bit closer home was the sit-in movement, spurred by the actions of the 4 freshmen who initiated the action, that was reawakened in February of 1960 at A&T College. Today it's A&T State University, Agricultural and Technical State University, in Greensboro, in my home state of North Carolina. I was 16 years old at the time and a junior in high school when this event took place. Of course, this event spread quickly among many people. It spread even to my small hometown. My town was so small that it had no public accommodations such as restaurants or theaters. Several people of my town did good portions of their shopping in the city of Wilmington, located 30 miles away. And Wilmington did have a Woolworth store and other stores that had lunch counter dining areas. It was decided that participants from our town would join with Wilmington participants in sitting in and thus demonstrating against the segregated policies that denied service to African Americans. I was by no means a firebrand leader at the time, and I think perhaps by some default, likely because I was a good academic performer and considered to be somewhat book smart, I was elected to be the president of our town group, averaging about a dozen teenagers per outing, which would be driven to Wilmington on Saturdays, the main shopping day, to join in the sit-ins. My parents and other adults of the community were in support of our activities. Some of the concerns addressed years earlier in the African American newspapers were now very much with us and dramatically drawing our engagement. When I entered A&T College as a new freshman in the fall of 1961, protests were still occurring in Greensboro and in many other areas. Marches against restaurant and movie theater segregation were taking place, and many students and some faculty were involved. A number of arrests, sometimes by the busload, were made. However, by this time, most people were released relatively quickly, and few charges were actively pursued. Many student leaders were actively involved. One of the student leaders at A&T College who played an important role at that time is someone with whose name we are quite familiar today. This is Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jesse Jackson. I think I had 2 classes with Jesse Jackson at A&T. Awareness was raising itself on many levels among the participants, and many in the nation and the world at large. As concern grew, more people would actively join in the work of the movement, including people from Iowa and other areas. Crests were reached in 1964 and 1965 with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act. And we used to quip a bit about the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that in 1965 our country became a democracy in 1965. So that was something to herald. Before then, everybody could not vote. Before then, in many states and many locales, African Americans were prevented from voting. So in 1965, our country became a democracy. We quipped that before then it was a pigmentocracy, but then we got the gradual move upward in 1965. The academic experience itself was another important marker or node that would develop into firmer branches. We remind ourselves again that this was the era of segregation, especially in the South. And all of my professors, except 2 white visiting professors and 1 Cuban visiting professors, were African American. North Carolina A&T was the college for African American. And there were other colleges, of course, for African Americans too. North Carolina had a tripartite system. It had colleges for white Americans, colleges for African Americans, and there was a college for Native Americans in North Carolina at the time. Since then, of course, we have seen many changes that have occurred. I still have very positive memory associations of several professors, especially some of the professors of the English department. When I first went to college, I had the idea that maybe I would major in mathematics, because mathematics was one of my favorite subjects in high school. And we were, I think we were pressured to declare a major during our first term at A&T at that time, so I chose mathematics. But another thing happened too. I was on a work-study program, and my job was working in the library. And I had never had access to so many books before. Naturally, I guess none of the students had. But for me, it was an amazing experience to have all of that access. And I found myself taking more and more literature courses. And so I decided by the end of my freshman year that I would prefer to major in literature. I'll take a small digression here in which you may find some degree of irony when it is underscored how that my major did turn out to be English. English majors had the task of serving during the sophomore year as something of assistants. We call them glorified gophers to members of the English faculty. And I was assigned to one of the speech teachers. And she, in a good fashion, quickly became amused at my pronunciation of certain words. At times, she would actually bait me to utter some pronunciations, and she would chuckle and even give twinkling-eyed laughs at my renditions. All in all, she gave me useful pointers toward correcting or at least using more standard substitutes for my green swamp dialect sounds. Later, I would take a graduate course in the history of the English language, and my paper for that course focused on Black English, a sort of history of Black English. And then, of course, it had already done so, but by that time, my greater appreciation also derived regarding speech communities and patterns and looking at the logic of that language that I spoke earlier. Years later, I would joke that I learned English as a second language. There was one area in which I became quite useful to Mrs. Johnson. In a class of hers that was probably something like developmental speech, she would take students responding to questions or she would have them read certain passages. Then she would have the taped passages transcribed so that she might work with the students on improving their speech. Because of some dialect usages, there were passages which she could not transcribe. Then she would ask me to transcribe them. I found this task relatively easy to do. Although some of the dialect patterns were perceptibly different from mine, I found them all accessible and provided written transcripts for her. She got an even bigger kick out of some of the words and sounds here than she had gotten out of mine. We went on to become good friends. Our department chair at the time was Darwin Turner, and I took courses from him. He would later teach at the University of Michigan and would serve for several years as the chair of the African World Studies program at the University of Iowa. I would go on to get to know Darwin Turner as a colleague when, in addition to teaching full-time at Coe College, I would teach adjunct courses in African American literature at the University of Iowa. Another English professor was William Robinson, from whom I took Shakespeare and American fiction. He would go on eventually to teach American literature in his home state at the University of Rhode Island. Walter Daniel, from whom I took courses, would later become the chancellor of the University of Missouri. When opportunities opened broader, the subsequent experiences of these African American professors further demonstrated that they were very valuable assets. I suppose that my exposure to them was something of a mixed blessing of the segregation era located in some places and in the quasi-segregation era in other places, during which time African Americans had more limited choices as to where they could study or work. One observation that may be made is that there are many elements that may be factors or situations which go on to develop in their various stages, and that we may become more conscious of this eventuality as we move through our phases. The students here who are beginning or taking, as well as those who are continuing at more advanced levels, their ventures in African American studies may take heed of honing their elements toward finer, more finished, progressive stages as their studies proceed. With well-polished elements, there may emerge more firmly finished end products, which can serve as valued planks in the march toward a blend of personal and community and societal fulfillment. No matter what one's professional work may turn out to be, the planks provided by African American studies may expand viewing areas and open some windows that provide insight which might otherwise be evasive. Thus, the viewer here may be more perceptive and well-rounded and better equipped to deal and work with and complement the co-workers and communities where we may find ourselves situated. To get to know our society more accountably is a notable step toward needed improvement. As more awareness spreads of the reality and value of diversity in our communities and lives, we have obligations to prepare our students to face situations in a well-equipped fashion. To acquire greater understanding is one goal of the educational trek, and the discipline of African American Studies can aid the success of obtaining this goal. One other paramount goal is to equip students with skills that, in addition to their particular classes and majors, will be useful in a variety of situations and other disciplines in seeking to promote the well-educated person. As I think back on some of my students, a few examples of this principle come to mind. This is an exercise that all of us who have taught for some time can do, even when we lose track of some names and some faces in the process. When I retired from teaching in 2010, some of my former students, some who graduated during the 1970s, held a sort of a small reunion that took place in Las Vegas. And I was invited there, so they gave my wife and I a trip to attend that reunion, in effect. I was also attended by the co-college president, who also attended, and I think the alumni director was attending as well. And anyway, we had a wonderful dinner. We had some wonderful times to reminisce, and we were there for about 3 days, catching up with each other and finding out what each other had been doing. Some of those students I had not seen since they had graduated in 1970 and 1971 and 1972. Some I had seen. A few of them still live in Iowa, and some I had seen returning to events such as homecoming occasionally as well. But many of them I had not seen since then, and it was remarkable to talk with them almost as if we had just seen each other recently, in a way. On some other occasions, who are you? It took some difficulty in localizing them in a manner. One of the students who attended is a student who graduated in the early 70s, and his major was Black literature. Then we did not have a formal full program or major, but students could do interdisciplinary majors. They could fashion their own majors and arrange to take courses that would support that endeavor. So this student fashioned a major in Black literature, and naturally took most of his courses from me, but he also took some supportive courses from some of the other departments as well. This student went on to become a medical doctor, and he worked for a number of years as a medical doctor. And he also taught at the Medical College of New Jersey. And recently, last year in 2011, he was announced as the new dean of the medical school of Howard University, where he is serving now. So this is, of course, one case of beginning in Black literature and ending up, of course, attending medical school and becoming the dean of medicine. But this student reminded, and part of the presentation that we had there, he reminded me and the others that one of the things he learned from his African American literature classes, is that he said that these classes, and particularly one class, a seminar in Richard Wright, that taught him really how to do research. And after that, and taking science classes and going on to take classes in medicine, it became very, very, very handy for him, because he was assigned his class. He said he was perturbed because I kept asking him to rewrite his papers initially, and to find out more information and to put it into better fashion. And eventually, I had to send him to some of the earlier journals in the library at that time. I think still are located in the basement of the library. And he remembers sort of filtering through them until he developed his method of doing it and felt confidence in it. And so he was able to use those techniques to aid him later. Of course, we can do that in many kinds of experiences in many classes as well. Another student who majored in black literature, I think he must have graduated in 1974, I think, went on to, he majored in black literature and political science. He went on to work for a number of years in the juvenile court system here in the state of Iowa, working primarily in Cedar Rapids, but also worked in Iowa City as well. He retired a few years ago. He retired, I think, a couple of years before I did, so we joke about that at times. Here I am. I said, I'm still busting rock, and you are now retired. But what he's doing now is that he's writing a couple of books, some material that he is now getting back to. He has preparing a book of poetry and also a book of short fiction as well. So there's still some time to get back to some of this activity. Another student worked in African American studies, and she became a reporter for the Cedar Rapids Gazette for a number of years. And then she went to work at the University of Iowa in the Public Relations Department, I think. And then she went on to earn a PhD in journalism. So she's now working at the University of Iowa. Another student majored in African American Studies and Political Science. This was a student from Nigeria. And he went on to get a PhD in political science. Another student from Japan went on to do graduate study, eventually at the University of Massachusetts, and to earn his PhD. And so now he's teaching now in Japan. Another student from Japan went on to get her terminal degree in history. Another student got hers in English. Another student from African American Studies went on to get an MA in English and then went on to get a PhD in philosophy. And she's teaching at Michigan State University. A more recent student has gone on to major in African American Studies and to then go on and get an MA in theology. And now she's a minister. These are some examples, and of course some students will take, even a course or a few courses rather than to major in the discipline. But, and no matter what the discipline is, as we teach low enough, I suppose, this happens in a manner. But the point is that in the discipline here, enough students were enthralled and energized by it to go on and have other accomplishments as well. And of course, students who teach high school or grade school can shore up their awarenesses by taking courses in this discipline and other related disciplines as well. So there is a grouping of some of the rewards, in this activity. And these students here, whom I have just mentioned, show that, I think, in a good a good fashion. Now that I am retired, I wonder if I am retired. My routine still is about the same as it was before, with only one big change. I don't have to go to class. And, of course, my schedule is much more flexible than it was before either. But yet I think I'm still branded with habits that would take a long time in easing down somewhat. So now, we will now entertain questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Professor Randall. The floor is open for questions or comments. There's a microphone there. Please ask your questions, or if you want to make a comment, just take the microphone and please be very brief. Yes, please, go ahead.
What was the marker that moved you from A&T to Cope College?
After I finished A&T in 1965, and then I worked that summer in the paper mill. And I was actually even offered a permanent job in the paper mill, but I wasn't ready for that at the time. So then I went on to continue school at that time it was called Carnegie Institute of Technology in English. And today it's, of course, Carnegie Mellon University. And while I was there, I had a professor with whom I clicked with well in a number of ways. And later he left Carnegie Mellon and moved to Coe College to become the department chair at Coe College. And later I was sort of recruited in part through him, through his suggestion. One of the co-professors was going on sabbatical for a year, and I took a year off to come teach at Coe for 1 year. And that 1 year has spread out to become 40 years. But that was one of the immediate connections in that way. A good amount of it has. I've taught courses in poetry, and some of the poetry courses resonate very well with me. One of the poets that I taught, in addition to some of the more recognizable standards, was a poet who was from Virginia. Sterling Brown. And some of you may be familiar with some of Sterling Brown's poetry. If you're not, you can do a web search on him. You can even get recordings of Sterling Brown reading from his material. And he has a very black Southern accent. Yes, his vocabulary and his poems are sort of warm and welcome and real. It's filled with some humor, some sarcasm, but also some very thoughtful material as well. So Sterling Brown is one. For a number of years, I taught a seminar in Richard Wright, and that had resonated very well with me as well. So I liked teaching that seminar in Richard Wright. And later I also did a seminar on a number of occasions on James Baldwin. And so we looked at his work closely. And for a number of years I did a seminar on Toni Morrison. So we looked at most of her work, good bodies of her work as well. Another period that resonates with me well is one of the periods of my generation, and this is the Black Arts movement of the 1960s and 1970s, And so we looking at some of the material produced during that period also. So these are some of the examples. Mm-hmm.
Questions, comments? My students are here smiling and taking in all this information from Professor Randall. So they are all anxious and eager to challenge.
Else you might have to shake his hand again.
Comments, questions?
I teach ethnic studies here at Iowa State, and sometimes I wonder, my subject is Asian American studies, and many of my students are not Asian American. And sometimes I wonder how I should communicate with them and what they should be taking from my course. Could you tell me what are good reasons for students who are not African American to take a course in African American studies?
Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, a very present reality in the environment of Coe College, for example. Most of the students taking my courses were not African American students because of the demographics of the college in ways. And there are some other things, of course, which I guess maybe motivate them toward taking the studies as well. That is, if they have sensitivity toward opening up paths toward diversity in some ways, at least being familiar with it in ways, and realizing that once they become more active in the outer world beyond college, they're dealing with a very broad society, very diverse society, in which they'll be working with and living with many other groups in ways as well. So I look at it in part as a manner of another step in preparation for life, another step in preparation for real life. And for those who have genuine concerns about being better prepared in facing real life, it is an asset. It is practically a necessity to become fully educated, to be aware of some of these things, of these moves. Otherwise, one is crimped somewhat by not being more exposed to it or more aware of it. So it's my grandmother used to say, this medicine is good for you, and sometimes it even tastes good in a way. So that's an element of it as well. It is the real thing, the real world. And there are many enjoyable things within it. And much of the material is enjoyable within itself because it's well arranged, it's well produced, it's even entertaining in a very positive, serious way as well. So these are some opportunities to fill in some of the gaps, some major ones and some small ones, in fashioning ourselves to be more complete.
You said you went to a colored school when you were younger.
Mm-hmm.
Through college, did you notice discrimination and segregation as well?
North Carolina, at the time that I came along, was fully segregated. So I went to a segregated grammar school, segregated high school, also segregated college. When I got ready to go to college in 1961, I could not attend University of North Carolina or Duke University or Wake Forest University or North Carolina State University because of racial discrimination. And so the college that I ended up attending, of course, was A&T College, one of the historical black colleges at the time. Things began to change during that decade, and some things changed fairly quickly. But that was the situation there. And so I did not attend an integrated school until I left North Carolina and then went to graduate school. But that was the case then. Segregation fully filtered in, not only in the educational system, but in many other ways of life at that time as well, in North Carolina and in a number of other southern states. Ironically, North Carolina was sometimes called, regarding that segregation situation, the best of the worst, in a way. But sometimes I'd wonder about that in ways. But that was the case then.
Questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Should professors in African American studies engage in politics?
Well, I think it's a matter of I don't know. I guess we could probably raise that question of any professor. As a professor of chemistry, chemistry engaged in politics. In some ways, I think. Of course, I do understand that there are some expectations, perhaps, maybe even some sensitivities that professors of African American studies would become more aware of. In my undergraduate college, for example, some of the professors at North Carolina A&T did march with the students in the protest march. And some did not, but a number of them did. So they became engaged in it because that was part of the world and part of, I think, a larger sense of responsibility, that there were many involved in it there. Today, I think that in many ways we are aware of our constituency, of our students as a group. We want to remain open and communicable to all of them. We're sensitive toward shunting some off, but we still have responsibilities that need to be fulfilled. Sometimes, as they used to say, sometimes we need to tell the truth when we come across some situation that demands the truth in some ways. And sometimes the truth, I think, does touch on some, what some may regard it as some political positions or even maybe political statements in some ways. But I think we need to be accountable to that and for that. And we need to be judicious. We need to be aware of I think, of our students as their larger concerns and their larger needs. I don't think we should shrift any one group for other groups in that way when they all come for the bounty, hopefully, that we can bestow on them. I've been in situations when I was a student in graduate school, for example, where some professors did actively participate in what would be called, political actions in some ways, and some others not, in a sense. So I think here it sometimes depends upon how the professor herself sees it in a way, and how comfortable they are with doing what they are doing. And if the truth calls for reaction in certain ways, what can we do? But sometimes go with it or yield with it. But we need, again, to keep in mind, I think, all of our students, and that our attempt to minister to all of them.
Thank you very much. And I hope what you have read would appear as part of a memoir or biography. Extremely powerful.
how would you characterize the nature of race relations in the American society today as compared to maybe your earlier years?
Yeah. Compared to my earlier years, in many ways, there's a lot of movement. That is very visible in ways. I mentioned, for example, that when I was ready to attend college, I could not attend the University of North Carolina. Today, the University of North Carolina has several African American and African professors. They are, productive and engaging in a number of ways as well. Some other things happen too. You can't think of the University of North Carolina in some other ways today and not think of somebody like, Michael Jordan, for example. Even though that's maybe on periphery in some sense, but take a look at the images that do appear, and opening other kinds of doors for people to participate in as well. So I think that in general, there has been a lot of movement. On the other hand, we are aware of a lot of other things that have taken place too. Some things, to me, not so progressive. We remember even some political things. I remember a few years ago, this happened in reference to a politician from South Carolina. Statement made by a politician from Mississippi. This was when Trent Lott used to be a senator, was saying of Strom Thurmond, Strom, you were right back then, when Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party because of some malinterest in civil rights in a way. And when we see other things that happen too, with the way in which I think some progressive things happen, and some things have, in some veins of some of the parties, we see kind of a flip-flop. Today, many of and conservatism has many positive attributes to it, but sometimes when we look at some brands of it, it has some attributes to it that sometimes we think about too, and look at the Southern politicians today in ways and think about some of them are open to civil rights progression, but others not so much in some ways. And so these are the leaders of the societies, and if they are thinking in some skewered ways, or that some of us may consider skewered or negative ways, what do we think about that, behind the sort of real annals of power in some sense too? So we haven't reached the promised land, but I think we have moved steps beyond where things were earlier. Yes, there are still many situations dealing with racial relations and experiences of people that as a society we deserve to have cleaner forms of living, that we need some of the progressive things to proceed further. Many of the ideas of Martin Luther King, for example, still need to be fully realized when we think of a community of citizens that can identify with each other and move with each other in some ways too. And maybe this is an idealistic waft that is true for many parts of the world. But I think that we still have a ways to go, but I think that we have come, from my experience, we have come a long way. And where I used to say, what was that thing about almost, when I was a kid, the governor of North Carolina was against democracy. The senators were against democracy. The congressmen were against democracy, and they said it loud and were almost bragged about it, won elections because of this thing of being anti-democratic and of being against political rights for all people and equal rights for all people. They couldn't do that, as boldly now in some ways. So yes, we have moved, but still we have ways to go as well.
Would you address the issue of change regarding race in the state of Iowa? I take it from your remarks that you've been here almost 40 years.
Yes.
And so could you characterize what it was like when you arrived and how you feel about it now?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I came to Iowa in 1969, well, I left North Carolina in 1965. And in the meantime, I lived for a short time in Pittsburgh and a short time in Indiana, and then had come to Iowa. There are a lot of things that I still saw through the eyes of North Carolina, and most things were improvements over the general state of North Carolina. But I was also reminded that there were some things that were not so smooth in Iowa as well. And I think there has been changes. We can see it in some ways from the state level down to some local levels. We can see, for example, even how effective it is or not, the Commission on Minority Concerns, for example, from the state level on down. And then we see positions taken by colleges and universities regarding diversity in ways that are much more dramatically present than we saw them at that earlier time as well. When I came to Iowa, naturally I had the impression that Iowa was a progressive place. After all, I was from North Carolina, in which things were not so progressive in that sense, in that way. So, but since that time, yes, I have seen some improvements occur, but I always also see, too, trying to be realistic and looking at things that I do really see as well. There are many occasions, for example, of developing good camaraderie relationships and good co-worker, collegial relationships, good friendship relationships in many ways. And I think all of us experience that, and we can value that in positive ways as well. Many of us would like to see it spread, even become more apparent in ways. So in general, when I first came, from the surface, it looks like there has been improvements.
Yeah. As I look around here or other universities, members of the African American studies come from different disciplinary backgrounds. Some are historians, some are sociologists, some are language and literature. Are there certain disciplines that you consider should comprise the core disciplines of an effective African American study?
Well, I think I think that when we do, when some of us do look at cultural studies programs, I think sometimes we do focus on some discipline representation. I think literature is one because it fits in some ways the voice of the culture, and sometimes even though it is a distilled voice of the culture in ways. I think history, naturally, also speaks to the voice and some records of experiences in the culture. Sociology, for example, anthropology, even in here, it might not be as apparent completely, but I guess some veins of music in ways. I can see that being a part of a larger umbrella of things in a way. Even political science, for example. Religion, I can see that being a part too, depending upon the interest, the degree to which a given professor has prepared himself, herself in it, and what they want to present from it in ways. So I think we have some choices there, and some breadth and some perspective. I have even heard, although I have to look at it closely, some consideration given of some scientists being part of the discipline in some ways. On the other hand, science is science. It's in that way. But again, I guess I suppose to the degree in which some things are culturally sensitive in some ways, maybe there can be argument for that as well. But I do agree that some disciplines, like some of the ones that I mentioned here, and some related ones, right, can be regarded. Yes.
So just a follow-up question, because I was thinking of that during public engineering. I was thinking of listening to you, and there's a lot of rich technological advances that is related to African American, and somehow it's kind of silent when we talk about African American. Why do you think that should be part of that discussion with African American?
I think it should be. I think it should be. I think it naturally. I think it adds to. It's already there, but I think it adds to the understanding of the greater degree of the humanity within it in ways, of the coverage within it in ways that it is there. And I think there's a place for it, even in the discipline of something called African American Studies. And looking at whether it would fit in some sociological representation or some anthropological representation, and looking at the lives or careers or contributions of people who have done some good work in those areas, that yes, there is a good deal of room for that, and I would support that. Yeah. By the way, the school that I attended, North Carolina A&T, also has a good engineering school. One of the better national engineering schools, and a lot of engineers come from North Carolina A&T. It was a good school. Had a good engineering school even when I was there back in the 60s as well.
All right.
We have one more, I think.
Okay, sure.
I currently live in Eastern North Carolina. I think socially it's still very much segregated, and I'm wondering if you ever see the South really getting past that, and if so, how?
Well, I think it has to, otherwise. Otherwise, they're going to be something to play. It is very much there, of course, in a lot of ways. And I think sometimes, of course, things move much more. For us who want things to move faster, they move much more slowly. And it's a shame, because I still see when these things are not done timely, I still see it. And again, even though I speak a little plainly about it, as a kind of theft of the people who are being stolen from, and even the ones who maybe inadvertently end up committing part of the theft. It's sort of a sin against them too, in keeping people from their rights and their potentials and their enjoyment of life. It's really sort of it's a contradiction. We think of ourselves as being, like to be the good society and doing good things and ways, but yet indirectly and indirectly we still end up hurting a lot of people and stealing from a lot of people in those ways. I think the more we can realize that and to realize our roles in it, it's still going to continue for too long. Mm-hmm.
Professor Randall, I just have, this is the last question. Mm-hmm. And
mm-hmm.
I want you to share your experience, help us understand, those of us who teach in ethnic studies, or even, any instructor at all in any discipline.
Mm-hmm.
We live in times of racial profiling.
Mm-hmm.
I can choose to go to class and pretend that my students don't know what's going on out there. I can pretend and go to class and just teach,
mm-hmm.
From a detached point and just ignore what's going on, the conversation, mm-hmm. the racial conversation going on outside.
Mm-hmm.
And say my students are not, they don't watch the television, they don't read, they're not aware.
Mm-hmm.
We can choose to do that as instructors.
Mm-hmm.
But we can also choose a much more engaged approach and say, okay, let me talk to my students about this topic. Now,
mm-hmm.
how should we approach that?
Mm-hmm.
With our students. We know what's going on in the country today. We know the racial conversation going on. We know the racial tension going on. Should
mm-hmm.
we ignore that and simply go to class and teach and leave our students wondering?
Mm-hmm.
Or should we engage our students? If so, how?
Mm-hmm.
In a way that they that they will approach these issues informed and not with emotions.
Mm-hmm.
How should we approach that?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking specifically,
right.
I don't want to dance around the issue.
Right.
Specifically
mm-hmm.
of
mm-hmm.
the
mm-hmm.
issue of Zimmerman and
mm-hmm.
Trayvon Martin
mm-hmm.
as an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is a very, very real issue. And a lot of people experience it, sometimes in direct ways and sometimes in indirect ways. I think that sometimes it's always good, although it doesn't always come. It's always good, as much as we can, to get some of the interest and even conversation generated in part by students, hopefully voluntarily, and if not voluntarily, sometimes by raising certain kinds of questions and having them move toward it to the point that they can begin to raise a question or to take a look at the issue that is there, or raising questions ourselves. I think that will draw out certain responses, or at least open up possibilities of looking at things from different angles, and then beginning to assess those things and seeing which one is more likely the case or less likely the case. And if it is more likely the case, what are some of the what's some of the reasoning that supports that, or less likely the case, some of the reasoning that supports that too. In some ways, I think it helps to have it digested in a manner, or understood in a manner, even how much nudging it might take, but to have a bit of ownership from the part of the students in some way, to the degree that they can then see it and then begin to really see it and then really respond to it. And I think in some cases, of course, some of these things are deeply embedded and don't come out. And what if we do then? I still think we keep pushing too. And even sometimes ourselves to offer alternative possibilities. And that are put on the table, and then begin to examine them. And we are reasonably sure that we have put enough on the table for them to look at, to discern logical responses. And if they are not discerning logical responses, it almost demands a sort of a back up and look at it again until we can get them to somehow begin to see it. One thing that we do know is that it is a factor, that it is real, that this does occur, that this does happen in some ways. And so how can we get others to at least to examine it, And if they give it good examination and honest examination, then they're likely to come to reasonable responses. If they examine it and purport to really see it, and then come up with explanations that don't click in ways, then there's something not working there. So I don't think we throw in the white flag, but then we try it again.
All right, I want to thank you all for coming, for taking time out of your busy schedule, and my colleagues here, and my students, and Professor Randall. Thank you for sharing your experience, and particularly for selling African American Studies to my students. I've been trying to tell them that this will lead them to many professions.
All right.
And I'm glad that they're hearing from someone else. And so
Okay.
I have quickly prepared an improvised enrollment form, African American Studies minor. So you'll see me. Anyway, thank you, Professor Randall.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Make sure you write your names down this again. 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 Write your names down this